My name is Attila, and I studied and did a lot of things in my life. My family doesn't believe that I have a degree in finance, and they are right, because I'm interested in critical finance, not in finance. Also, sociology. I have a PhD in history, so I've been combining all kinds of things in my life. But it seems that the ultimate thing for me is this understanding of history as a totality. So this is why I'm combining all different things in order to understand. In a very much in the way like Georg Lukács was writing about in History and Class Consciousness. And today is it's more or less an accident. We were attending with Teoria a very good conference in Moscow, and then we started talking, and then all of a sudden this came up, and then I was very kindly invited to come here, which is always a good excuse to start working on something, right? And then I started thinking about something which has been annoying me for quite a time, but that was the moment when I realized that I was very gravely annoyed by certain things. And then let me go through these things. Once again, in case I think we need to make it sharper. No?
Va bene?
No.
Ok.
Un po' più grande? Andava bene?
Ok, sono io che non so.
So at home in Budapest we are doing a center named after Karl Polanyi. I don't know how much you are familiar with him. Karl Polanyi is a very important figure, one of the, beside Karl Mannheim and Georg Lukács, he is the big thing we have given to universal thinking. And Karl Polanyi was very much preoccupied with one thing, and I will come back to this again and again, is how we can stop market functioning as a devastating utopia. And what happens if this utopia is created in society? And I think that's a very important point, because, and I will come back to this again and again and again, because Polanyi had an insight into global history and social development, not something of homogeneous economic systems, but some kind of a mixture. And then I think latently he was trying to figure out some of the conditions. How to be in economies which are not dominated by various forms of integration like market, redistribution or household. So how to have a combination of that. Here is a quote, you don't need to read now, I think I can leave it here. Where basically Polanyi is one of the quotes I really like in his Great Transformation. This is about how devastating and perverse the system which is dominated by market and by a utopian market having a complete autonomy, that is to say, when market can dominate society completely. And at the end I will come back to this because most probably this is the reason we are going into very dark ages now again. because of this, market utopia has been practiced. Just in between us, Karl Polanyi was writing in 1945, in case you let free market into East European societies, you get fascism. This is what, in 1945, that was not something which we should not pay attention. The second thing is that concerning socialism especially, but even capitalism in a lot of ways, too many people argue that economic systems are homogeneous in terms of ownership, in terms of key basic economic mechanisms. So in case I would play a game with you, then I would say, what was the characteristic of state socialism? In terms of an economic system, what would be your reply? What characterized state socialism? Control by the state, right? Yes. And most probably you would go into this, it was a state ownership, homogeneously, right? And state redistribution, right? That would be the answer. And to be honest, this is blatantly wrong. And I think this has been completely I'm not saying that completely misconceived, but I would say very important points are missing from this picture. So all these debates, what you can have on socialism, oh, it was just state capitalism. The state behaved exactly the way how capitalists behave, but they actually had the whole country for that. This is a very general argument. For instance, made by my good old friend Gerrit Dale. Gerrit always goes public. He wrote a lot on Polanyi as well. Gerrit goes public and says, no, there was no socialism at all. It was not. It was state capitalism. Or you can have, such people. Another good friend and colleague of mine, Joseph Burret, who was saying that, look, state socialism was characterized that there was a property vacuum. That is to say, bureaucracy controlled the economy, and then basically nobody knew how to practice property in this. And I think this is wrong. Because I think the point they are missing is that just like all other economic systems on earth, socialism was also a mixed system, and which we need to conceptualize as a mixed system. And then the next thing why it's important is that I do believe that in case we can rethink the history of the first cycle of socialism, right, which is over. In case we get into a position, we have to be very careful. It's not just on us. History has to give us the opportunity to rethink history. Some people think that it's just an individual achievement. That's not true, right? So in case we get into a position to rewrite it, then we are going to be able to have the second cycle, right? Which means that now this is the preparation period. And I am doing my best to give a little bit into that kind of a discussion. The very last thing why it's so important for me is this horrendous cheap anti-communism which is going through all around the world again, most important in Eastern Europe, is so annoying and it's intellectually so poor that we really need to have very good and efficient counter-narratives. Because this anti-communist narrative is that this was some kind of a totalitarian control, and then basically it was just about certain elites massacring people all the time. They were very peaceful and had nothing to do with anything. This is not the way ahead. Now, before we go into this, let's play a little bit of a game, right? So let's go through certain names. Don't think that this problem of mixed economy has not come up in critical thinking. Right? And actually, I'm sure that I am ignoring some very important people. But let's go through. So the first thing is, once again, let's sum it up. The position of Karl Polanyi. But Karl Polanyi, you may say he was not a Marxist thinker. Nonetheless, many of his points were very close to a Marxist position. And actually, in one period of his life, in the 1920s and 30s, just before writing Great Transformation, as a sponge, he got a lot from Marxist critical thinking, right? Many of his key terms, let's say labor as a fictitious commodity, and so on and so on, are really Marxian type analysis going through his but his real contribution in terms, and I know that some people studied here anthropology, no? Who has studied anthropology?
It's not here.
Anyway, so what was Polanyi saying? Polanyi said that basically throughout history there are four forms how economy can be integrated into society. One was market, and he clearly said that market existed very early on, and he was correct. He actually worked a lot on antique economies, so he knew a lot of sources. But let's say you go to Sumerian sources, you can see that there was market. But of course, in the Sumerian temple economy, the key form was redistribution, which is the form number 2. Redistribution can be, physical redistribution, can be administrative redistribution, right? Which means that the goods are moving and not moving, and so on. Various forms can exist. But even at that time, market coexisted with redistribution. And also, very importantly, for a very long time, we have had, household economies. Right? Household economies, peasant economies, very important. Larger scale household economies, even in terms of landed estate. So we had all these systems. Actually, Polanyi wrote very nicely, the concept of economy is coming from household economy. Oikos in Greek means household, right? So householding is economy. And then he had one more form, which was coming from anthropology. He was reading Malinowski, and this was called reciprocity. This is basically a key system which exists in all societies. You cannot extinguish that at all. Namely, kind of exchange of gifts. That is, I'm doing some kind of a service for you, and somehow it's going to be symmetrical, and we are going to exchange things. So I can give you a talk on Polanyi, and you can actually cook me a very good coffee, and then we are not going to make any kind of an exchange. It's not an exchange. We are not seeing this as a value, but this is, showing friendship, solidarity, mutual recognition. Reciprocity, super important, right? For instance, now this is why some of the taxation authorities are really frightened, because society is doing these things, and they always want to see a revenue out of this. Okay. So, what Polanyi was saying is that all economic systems can be characterized by these four forms. And then we have to see which is more important than the other in certain areas and certain periods, and very importantly, how they are combined. So how the market coexists with this. And then, once again, for him the big problem was when market was imagined to be super autonomous. That is to say, that market was allowed to have no social control at all. And he said, these are rare moments, but if it happens, then it's a devastating moment, right? So market utopia is devastating. It's a satanic meal, he said, a satanic meal. Now, of course, when we are thinking about mixed economy, one of the first things which come to us, by the way, in case you have questions or comments, please do not hesitate to intervene, right? Of course, the next person who comes to mind when thinking about this is, of course, Lenin. Because there was this very important moment in the history of Soviet Russia that during war communism, which existed between, let's say, 1919, 1921, 1922, of course it was war communism because it was a completely based on a redistributive system. That is to say, they were taking away whatever possible things that they could, and then they were reallocating it. All production was controlled by bureaucratically and so on. But then it got into a crisis very soon. We would say normal because it was just too homogeneous in a lot of ways. So war communism got into a crisis, and then Lenin was still okay concerning that. And then he also said, no, we have to change this now, and then we have to have a sectorally mixed economy. It's a very important moment in history, and we should think a lot about this, because what he was actually saying, together with that guy, Buhari, and then what they were talking about was the following, that first of all, even foreign investment cannot be ruled out, foreign capitalist investment cannot be ruled out, in case it is in certain sectors and under some control. But very importantly, they made a rare moment in history when actually they were talking about how the peasant economy could be the key for accumulation in a socialist economy. Now, as you can imagine, this idea was not coming from Marx. And actually, it's very interesting that this is what Lenin approved also. Lenin, who was fighting a lot against those people who were saying that peasant economy is some kind of a third way. Nonetheless, they recognized two things. One is that, which is a very important thing, politically speaking, you have to feed the population. I mean, immediately if there are food problems, then you have riots. So they wanted to have that. Plus, very importantly, there was the industry was not big enough. Therefore, they had to look for new sources of accumulation. Right. And this was the moment when actually this new economic policy was introduced, and it existed for 4, 5, some people say 6 years up till 1928, when there is a complete reverse made by Stalin. Once again, I don't want to go into this mythology. Stalin was also not stupid. There were very strong reasons why they had to change the economic policy as well. In some ways, socialism is to be understood like capitalism. It has a lot of phases. A lot of social experiments are going on, and then one time it is working like this, and the other time it's working like that. So, I mean, we should not give up, right? But I don't want to go into that thing, what was around 1928. And I'm not going to defend any kind of massive political violence in certain scales. I mean, that's not my job. But we have to acknowledge that there were strong reasons to change the economic policy, right? First of all, just in between us, because during this mixed economy period, agrarian prices really went up. Workers were really complaining. So it was not the party making a thing. Workers were really unhappy because in cities they had problems concerning wages and food. Now, this was a phenomenal moment when actually they tried to use this. And what was the argument? The argument was that in case they allow small-scale, medium-scale peasant farming to operate for the market, then it would be a good solution. This is what Buhari was saying. Buhari had a huge debate with another guy, Preobrazhensky. Preobrazhensky was very much for industrialization, right? Forced and quick industrialization. Buhari was against that, and then that debate. But here comes one more guy who was, when I studied at economics, then I discovered this guy, and then I think I learned a lot from him. I don't know whether you have heard about Alexander Chayanov. You see, that's one of the things. Alexander Chayanov in agrarian history is taught everywhere. Because he was the guy who very quickly, you see, the Soviet period in the 1920s, from the point of view of universal thinking, is amazing. So basically that country was providing the key thinkers. Chayanov.
Okay.
Okay. In the 1920s, that country produced such figures that literally, I mean, it's even today for me it's difficult to imagine. And one of the big guys was Chayanov. By the way, don't worry, all of them were killed by Stalin. None of them survived. Chayanov was also executed. But Chayanov was working on the theory of peasant economy. And actually, he figured out why the program of the new economic policy could not work. Because he did the microeconomics of peasant family economy, and then he argued, due to internal structural reasons, that's not going to be the source for accumulation at all. Because, and here comes, I just give you the key idea. He basically made one thing. He said, in case there is no concept of wage because it's based on family labor, then you cannot calculate profit. Then what is the logic of the peasant economy? They are not stupid, of course. And then he argued that the key thing for peasant economy was a sense of self-exploitation. The point is not that, it's already beautiful, actually, to be honest. But the point is the following, that in case this is the logic, then the relationship between peasant economies and markets, mixed economies, it's going to be difficult. Because in a peasant economy, when prices are going up, then peasants actually reduce production. When prices go down, then they start working like crazy. So it's completely irrational from a market point of view, right? Because you should not increase your production when prices are going down, and then that's just the opposite. But he argued very nicely, and this is the thing. It's widely used in history and anthropology, right? So Chayanov really did the thing. He did this thanks to God having this fantastic zemstvo statistics in Russia. Zemstvo statistics, something very important, statisticians actually went to peasant households and spent 2 weeks there, right? And then writing down everything, fantastic statistics. And this is what he worked on. And then, can we have an original accumulation with better off peasants? The answer was no. And then that was one of the reasons why it could not be solved, this kind of a problem, which shows that there was the idea of the mixed economy, but it had inherent problems which it could not solve. And then came, the big change in 1928, and all of a sudden, first of all, Russian economists predicted the crisis already coming beautifully. Plus, very importantly, they also calculated that war would come, and they had to prepare for war. And then they started calculating how much industry they need to defend. Right. And then this is why they put aside, and then we go into the forced collectivization, and then we go into the heavy industrialization, and then we go into this dominance of the redistributive socialist economy, state economy, right, during the 1930s. But once again, earlier that was not the case. Okay. Now, other meanings of mixed in critical thinking. One which I like very much is coming from this Marxist thinker Ernst Bloch, who's over there. All these Marxist thinkers were heavy smokers. Lukács was also smoking like a chimney, right? Bloch also. So it's something with nicotine, I can tell you. Okay, so Bloch wrote very nicely, once again, a kind of a mixed system in terms of the mixture of different historical times in a society. Right? This problem of simultaneity, right? It's a difficult word. That is to say, he argued that there are subjective and objective non-simultaneity in society. The objective one is exactly the same problem what we were seeing before. Let's say peasant economy surviving, right? And peasant economy representing a different historical time, coexisting with other systems. The big now, as Ernst Bloch always said, the big now, right? And then he was saying that even as opposed to big now, they existed there, right? And then he also argued, very interestingly, that this interaction between the super-capitalist now and super-capitalist market and the peasant, there is a need to think it over. And then the point is, once again, you may say it's, it's basically classic modernization theory, right? Certain, old historical forms are going to disappear, right? But he argued, no. The key thing is the interaction. Actually, he very nicely said the dialectics. So once again, the mixed economy is conceptualized, and then it is becoming a kind of a historical force in itself, this interaction between the different things, right? So what is the interaction? The outcome for Ernst Bloch was very negative. Of course, he was writing this in, I think, the first version was written in 1931 or 32. He could already see blatantly clearly what was coming. Right? These bloody Marxists, they better see things in advance. I'm really surprised to see this, that these people really saw it was coming. And then he said that because of this dialectics, then there is going to be, fascist repression. And actually he developed very early on a theory of fascism based on these things, so coexistence, right? Now, we will come back to this, understate socialism as well, right? The dialectics of time. Right? Once again, I have not seen a single person trying to use Ernst Bloch for socialism. So it's a good PhD topic. I'm not kidding. It's a very good PhD topic. Okay, and then here is this guy, Alec Nove or Alexandre Nove. Have you heard about him? Really? He wrote one of the biggest and most important economic histories of the Soviet Union, right? And then he wrote a book. I like it's in my room now. I like the title, Feasible Socialism. He wrote that in 1983, that guy. And then he was saying, first of all, he understood that socialism was more mixed and much greater variety than anybody thinks. Very importantly, he was talking about this, that the East German, the Hungarian and the Yugoslavian and all these experiences were very different. There was no socialism, there was a dramatic variation of socialisms. And all these countries were following very distinct paths. Most importantly in economy. Just to give you some ideas, right? East German socialism ended up with, kind of a holdings. That is to say, big companies were made, so not the state bureaucracy was controlling the companies, but huge holdings were created and they coordinated production. Right? Then there was the Yugoslav example, this self-management. Kind of almost workers' councils. Just almost, because the state intervened. There was quite a lot of regulation and so on, but self-management. The Hungarians, and we will talk a lot about this today, experimented with a quote-unquote socialist market economy. And then there was the Soviet economy, very distinct, a huge combination, not to speak about countries like Cuba. Once again, very different. And even Cubans are still experimenting with a lot of things in between us, right? Okay. And then he argued very powerfully in this feasible socialism thing. He argued market is necessary. The only thing is that we have to figure out where and how to use it in socialist economies. It has to be severely controlled. Very Apollonian. In certain territories, central control is necessary. Large-scale heavy industry, military industry and so on. No way that you don't have a strong central control. It cannot be market. But he argued very much for the competitive smaller state enterprises, right? State-owned enterprises competing with each other. This is in some ways the Hungarian model, right? Okay. But he argued, because the Hungarians forgot this, and that was actually one of the biggest mistakes they could make. They did not listen to Lukács in the 60s, saying that you have to have self-management when you are doing this market reform. But this is what Alec Nova is saying. Cooperatives as kind of a collective enterprises, owning their own enterprises. He argued that smaller scale private enterprise, of course, no problem, allow it. It's not going to cause any kind of a trouble. And of course, individuals doing their own economy, and he was saying let's say intellectuals and then all these people can have their own individual enterprises, and it's fully okay. Alec Nova said that he was not an ideologue of this. He sat down and said, learning whatever I learned from East European socialist history, this is the best scenario, right? But very clearly the point of Alec Nova is also this: mixed economy. Various sectors, various actors, various types and mechanisms are being used at the same time, right? Okay, very importantly, all those who made the critique of the planned economy were also correct in a lot of sense, because they were pointing out so many inherent problems in centralized planning which could not be solved without a mixed economy. I give you one example. Investment cycles. Planned economy goes into investment cycles due to the specific mechanism, which means that time to time it gets into financial crisis because of that overinvestment. So at certain point it's overinvest, and then it has to cut back and so on. So it's a fluctuation. Right? This can be only solved by a mixed system. We had a lot of critiques when I studied in the mid-80s. I studied economics in Hungary. Of course, we read all these people. Now nobody talks about them. Right? Even there are names you would have never ever heard about. But the point I'm trying to make is very simple, is that socialism was not a homogeneous system. It was experimenting with a lot of things. And actually, to be honest, one of the big things for us is to get rid of the such forces which do not allow experimenting. I mean, sorry, human society is about experimenting. Meaning that we have to figure out. And this is why I find it absolutely disappointing that they say, oh, the market is a very good, my dear, right? But what about, and then in case you go against the market, then you end up in the corner, right? Okay, and then this is, I think, one of the reasons why we need to be a socialist is exactly this, to open up the possibilities in history, not the other way around. Right? Okay. Now, let's now talk about Hungary, but I stop here for a while because I'm just talking, and I have heard myself, for me, very boring. Questions up till now? Or comments? How much do you learn about the economic history of socialism? Nothing. We should start classes like the economic history of socialism, right? That should be one of the prime, targets. Honestly, because that's the only. We have to remember it, because that's the only way we can actually learn what to do next. If no other questions at the moment, then I go into the specific Hungarian story, which I find in some ways fabulous. Not because I was born there, but because I think that, I'm not against patriotism, but what to be proud of? That's the big question. And then of course I'm not going to be proud of anti-communist bullshit what Hungary is producing at the moment, but I'm going to be proud of things which really provided something very interesting, and there was some moments of history when we were really doing something. Yesterday, coming from the airport, we were talking about this, how, let's say, the Hungarian society looked like in the 1980s. Right? There was an enormous stability. You just can't imagine. I mean, politically there were problems, but socially speaking, country was amazingly stable. And I think, even after that, when you asked people in the 1990s and even later, which was the good period in their life and so on, they always pointed back. That period. And then you may say, like my liberal colleagues, that people are stupid. This is what liberals are happy to say sometimes. But people are not stupid. So I think that there was something to think about. Okay. Now, so of course we need to do critical history to have a really Lukácsian perspective, meaning including all the dialectics in the whole process, and then to combine discourses and material processes. Beside Lukács, of course, we have to read quite a lot from Antonio Gramsci as well. So all these people together. By the way, both thinkers were doing their things in the 1920s and 30s, right? Of course, and they also Ernst Bloch, and then of course they had similar problems, right? And then I use various people who are not Marxist, but they knew a lot about Hungarian agrarian history, and we have to pay attention to that.
Can I
yes.
raise a question about Lukács? Because you quoted Bloch about Ungleichzeitigkeit, and it's possible to see the problem also in Lukács, this question of mixed economy or temporality, plural temporalities.
Actually, what is, I think, in that sense, I mean, Lukács was far ahead of Bloch in a lot of things, but at certain points, I think Bloch was ahead.
Okay.
As compared to Lukács, because Lukács, when Lukács was writing about historical change, then he never had this kind of a thing that the immediate self-reflection of capitalist society is divided too much. And actually what he was doing is that, he was basically said, there is, market, and then it's going to produce a certain analytical self-reflection, and then this is the key thing in history, that it is a kind of a false consciousness because it's not pointing out and so on. But he never worked on this kind of an issue of, to the best of my knowledge, right? I mean, but the question is absolutely relevant. I think actually I think he avoided these things.
Okay.
Right? He avoided these things.
Because there is a kind of an article he wrote about the legacy of our time.
Yes.
And it was critic. So
No, in terms of aesthetics and in terms of, that's true. Okay. Now, but I think this problem occurred. I mean, this kind of what to do with this so-called feudal structure, right? I haven't mentioned one person whom I should have mentioned actually, which was also important, and that guy is of course Trotsky. Trotsky. Let's try to make notes now. Trotsky, when he wrote this book on the October Revolution, he wrote that in the 1920s. Of course, he asked this big question, which all Marxists were asking: why was there a revolution in Russia and not in another part of the world, right? And there he introduced something very important. I wanted to talk about him. Right? Here is this. Ernst Bloch. No, somehow I missed it. Okay. So Trotsky was talking about that Russian history has a very slow tempo in development, right? That was the thing. And actually, different stages of history coexisted. It's like Ernst Bloch. And then he got into this, and a lot of quite a number of economic historians that try to use this now, even today, this idea of combined development. Because he argued very importantly, he argued that when different stages, right, old feudalist structures coexist with super capitalist structures, right, then the outcome can be also positive. And then it can be positive because it can lead to some kind of a creativity. And then this creativity can actually end up in a great leap forward. So read the October Revolution, the beginning, right? And there you can find it. Once again, a super important thing, right? Okay. So this duality of East European societies came up again and again and again. There's a huge intellectual history. The only thing, what I'm saying is that not many people worked on the dialectics or the interaction between these things, right? And actually, this is my point, that we should point into that direction, right? How is this interaction? But a good point. And then we can actually go into many other people, but once again, for that we need not one talk, but a series of talks. Which I think is a good idea, that once we should have it, right? Now,
the next year we organize a series of talks by you.
Okay, very good. Let's do it together, right? Okay. So let's go into some historical details. First, I had an economic history professor, a very conservative guy, by the way, but a brilliant conservative guy. And he worked a lot on Hungarian agrarian history. And then he argued that some of the Marxist historians misunderstood one thing in East European agrarian history, namely they put too much focus on the ownership problem and then the size of the ownership. And then he argued, no, in agriculture the most important thing is that what is the actual use of land, right? And then he argued that large-scale production and small-scale production, they were not antagonisms, as let's say Lenin would have argued, but there was some kind of symbiosis. They were supporting each other in a lot of ways. The title of his book was Contradiction or Mutuality. And he argued mutuality. So he argued that Hungarian agricultural history was very successful, or the developments were rather good, when this mutuality was strengthened as opposed to the contradiction. And I think he had a point here. Namely that there is a possibility that it is not a contradiction, but they can supplement each other. Now, when we get into the period of post-war socialism in Hungary, then we see a kind of a history of dramatic turns. You know, in 15 years, the society went through a dramatic series of experiments. Right? So what happened? 1945, the Communist Party, together with the Peasant Party, started redistributing land. So they took away all large estates, even medium-sized estates, and then they basically distributed it. Actually, the famous Imre Nagy was the distributor, right? And then with this they created an enormous number of peasant households. These people had huge problem, because after the war there was a huge problem of machinery. So these people had no, in terms of animals, horse, and so on, but also in terms of machinery, huge problems. So basically these were really low productivity, kind of a family type economy, not really working out very nicely. And then of course, but nonetheless it was very much supported by historically built smallholder ideology. Hungarian peasants were always just waiting to have land. Now they get the land. So there was this massive, let's put it this way, in that sense, very conservative ideology immediately got into that. So this move on behalf of the Communist Party, we actually created that, which the Communist Party actually recognized that with this they have a problem. What to do with this? And then from 1948, when the radical phase of the communist transition started, by that time they nationalized all the key banks, companies, and so on and so on. They started nationalizing even further on, and they started making cooperatives, following the Soviet example. And they were doing this in a forceful manner, and they created, let's put it this way, machinery centers controlled by the state, and then cooperatives using these machinery centers, and then the machines out of that. Also, they introduced a no-wage system in the cooperatives, so-called labor units. They introduced. We know such things. I mean, in case you go to a kibbutz in Israel, you also had this kind of thing. In cooperative system, this labor unit system is an idea. Nonetheless, in the cooperatives, there were, a very much a non-market system was created. Right. At the same time, the state started taking away of the so-called extra product of the individual owners, which was of course seen in a very negative way by the peasants, but the state actually collected and redistributed. Nonetheless, the whole agriculture was not really very successful. There were food problems. Basically, there was a continuous crisis. Now, but one thing is very interesting, which I never knew really, that the number of cooperatives in the beginning, the first wave of collectivization between 49 and 53 they collectivized not too much, right? They collectivized let's say 200,000 or something like that individual farms, while the number of the private holdings remained very high, right? Till the early 1960s, the second wave of collectivization, right? So basically the country started experimenting with this socialist type of economy. Nonetheless, this experiment was not very successful and it was very limited. And after 1953, the experiments did not work out very well. They also used forced labor and so on. And then Imre Nagy got into power again as a prime minister in 1953. And then in 1953, he started allowing reprivatizing cooperatives, plus very importantly, calming down the situation as much as possible. And then they immediately started thinking about introducing some market elements. But they could not finish this experimenting and thinking because the revolution came. The 1956 revolution, which was, of course, a very complex thing. First of all, in 1956 in Hungary, the workers' councils were very important, very progressive, fantastic ideas came into existence immediately. Also at the same time, peasants were revolting against the cooperatives, so they took back even more land. So it was another phase. And then, of course, there were very conservative elements, even I can say reactionary elements already there during the revolution. And then it was a dramatic mixture. Of course, the fight for independence is something very important. And then as soon as the country was crushed by the Soviet army, then it was a dramatic historical and social shock for people. Right? But very interestingly, this led to a new experiment. First of all, I'm just trying to really, this is the first time I'm telling this, so allow me. So the first thing is that these family economies were very problematic. So anybody who is now saying that bloody communists took away all kinds of things and then it was okay, they are wrong. These peasant economies, as Chayanov also pointed out, they had internal problems. And then there was a very famous, actually, piece later written based on the 1950s experiment. You can read it, Fehl and Hofer. This is the proper peasant. That is to say that, private farming had problems. Actually, Poland maintained the private farms. And then later, Poland always had a problem concerning agriculture. Right? So basically Poland did not make the reform what Hungary later did. Right? Or they did a kind of a semi-successful reform in that. And then that's it. Now what happened was that in 1959 the Kada regime actually started the second wave of collectivization, right? Right. So this is the first wave, and then the second wave of collectivization is coming here. Sorry, it's coming here. And then basically this is the cooperative system. So basically it shows that by the 1960s and 70s, the share of cooperatives in terms of ownership became very big. But you can already see that this is some kind of mixed system, because of course there are state farms, cooperatives, and then there are also private ownership. Right? Okay. So it's already a combination. And here came the very creative solution. And that's what I'm saying. A creative solution how to do a mixed economy. Because taking away the land from the private owners was a huge problem. Right? There's no single group which is happy about being forced to give up property, right? Especially among peasants, right? I'm sure that you go to the south of Italy and then you would tell, oh, no, okay. You go to the cooperative, they make a ham out of you, right? No? Immediately. But here, first of all, there was political repression. So people did not dare to go too loud. Right? Second, the Kadar regime, so János Kadar, who actually came back with the Soviets, he was a supporter of Imre Nagy during the revolution in the beginning, then he disappeared, then he came back with the Soviet troops, then he became the party secretary. You may not have heard about him, so but János Kadar was doing it. And then they made a very good trick. When they forced people into the cooperatives, they immediately put the leading landowners in a village into the leadership of the cooperatives. So they were actually shifted the whole thing. They were not looking for the poor peasants to take over, because they said we need that they needed the knowledge of these people. And with this, actually, they basically reconfigured the position of these people, which was, politically speaking, not a stupid maneuver. Because immediately these people, using their own influence as well, could start, working in the cooperatives, but in a new structure, which meant that they were not doing this as a large-scale landowner, like in Brazil or something like that. Then immediately they started marketizing the cooperatives in two ways. First of all, the cooperatives became some kind of communal enterprise. They could set what they wanted to produce and how they wanted to sell it. Right? Also, very importantly, the Hungarians were not stupid, as opposed to some of the other East European countries, because they understood one more thing. In order to have success in agriculture, you need relatively high agrarian prices, which is always a problem in socialism. Too high prices would mean that workers complain. But then they made the prices high enough that the profitability of these activities, profitability, so the revenue making opportunities of these collective enterprises were okay. Which meant that they were willing to produce, which meant that there was no food shortage, which meant that the country once again became a food exporter, because all these things were going okay. And here they made one more trick. This is what they called the separation of large-scale production and the household and auxiliary economy. This is how they put it, right? Auxiliary economy. So, the cooperatives started producing large-scale, production of crops, grain, maize, all these things, where there is a, scale problem of production. But there was the problem what to do with the animal husbandry and what to do with fruit and vegetables. Right? Of course, these cooperatives were producing some, but then here they made a fantastic trick. Seeing that people loved their land holding, they said, okay, no problem. A certain size of land you can have. Even more, the cooperative is going to help you. So the machinery of the cooperatives were used to, let's say, to do the hoeing or whatever in your private garden, right? Plus, very importantly, the cooperative started giving you, food for the animals at a rather low price, which meant that you get the maize in a massive scale into your own. And then they made even more tricks, saying that they made special agreements with these family households or family economies, and they were saying that, look, we have a young animal, breeding is a problem, you take out the young animal, you breed the animal, we give the food for that, and at the end we buy it back. which was a win-win situation for everybody. There was a massive meat production, rather good quality actually. Then the markets could be filled with all this production, and then the family households are owning a little land, but they could produce a lot in terms of animal husbandry. They controlled less than 10% of the land. Nonetheless, in terms of fruit and vegetable, which was also freely allowed to go to be marketed, they produced 50% of the total production. Very intensive thing. Of course, what was the good thing politically in this? From the point of view of a frightened socialist government, was that these people worked day and night. They got up at 3 in the morning. They started feeding the animal at 4. Then they went to the cooperative to work, and so on and so on. And then they returned, they finished it. So by 8, they were completely dead, right? So the amount of time they could spend on political organization was very limited, right? But these people started accumulating money. So immediately the Hungarian countryside became very rich. Because, just to have, 2 bulls at home, out of that, selling back to the cooperatives, they could buy a small car. Which meant that, really there was something immediately started going on. Plus, very importantly, the different forms of ownership, they were not against each other, but they were like this. Right? Which meant that they really experiment. I can tell you, this was not in any of the pieces written down by previous Marxist thinkers. Right? But once again, this was a post-capitalist society. The market could not ruin everything because it was not just controlled by basically the capital market was completely abolished, even land market was abolished. So it was not buying and selling land and accumulating that. So it was post-capitalist, non-capitalist society, and immediately the mixed economy started working. And then one more thing is a couple of other things, how to make this mixture even more mixed. Not only families in the countryside did this kind of a vegetable and fruit production, but urban families as well. To be honest, this is part of my childhood. I always wanted to watch the television and read. That was my favorite. So nonetheless, every weekend I had to work in a rather huge garden. So actually I know what it means, how to cultivate land. So this is what I can tell, that in case you kick me out, I'm very good in gardening. I can do that, no problem. Because urban families also use this as an auxiliary income. And of course I don't need to talk about the quality of this things. Today for me it's a pain to eat vegetables. Because I know what, because this is what we did. We produced a lot for ourselves. So when I was a kid I was eating that, right? Because it was auxiliary. So urban industrial families could also go out, right? So it was not kind of a dacha system just to, go and relax, but producing, right? Very importantly. Which meant that the food prices could be high because urban families were also providing things for themselves. Once again, a combination of various systems. Also very importantly, these families in the countryside, actually they combined things even more, because the classic situation in the 60s and 70s in the families were elderly men worked in the cooperatives. Women took care of this, feeding the animal and so on and so on. Plus, there was these cooperatives could make their own industrial plants. So they actually, it was difficult. In a non-capitalist society, it's difficult, how you establish a company and so on. It's not so simple. But these cooperatives were allowed to establish, let's say, dairy production plant, or how to make wooden boxes, so textile industry, and mainly women went into that. So it was, once again, it was a mixture. It was, of course, gendered, very repressive, don't misunderstand me, right? The only thing I'm saying that they combined certain things, which meant that everybody was super stable, right? The problem started later in the 1980s when, let's say, textile industry started going down because of the China coming up. Right? There were also some other things, and then on the level of families, because this, to live in the countryside is not so fancy, right? There was a dramatic move towards cities, but nonetheless, a lot of people could not move into cities because of housing problems as well. And then, therefore, the younger men started commuting to industry from the village. The elderly men remained there. Some of the women also commuted into various sectors, but they stayed at home. So once again, on a local level, it was super. Let's use the term of Polanyi. The whole economy was super embedded. This was the key term of Polanyi. Economy was very much embedded into society. What does it mean? That family, social ownership, state ownership, market could coexist, right? And control each other. Now this was, of course, then of course nothing is, history is going on, right? We never stop. And then it had quite a lot of problems. But we can say that Polanyi was correct. These integration mechanisms were very well combined, made out well. And then here I tell you that even in industry, they started experimenting with the same thing. That is to say, in industrial plants, they started allowing people to have their own little quote-unquote company. It was called labor community, and they could use the machinery of the socialist state-owned plant for their own purposes. Once again, very problematic in a lot of ways, but an experiment. It was super labor intensive for sure. They solved one of the problems, labor shortage in the socialist economy, because that was one of the things. And of course, unfortunately, it was also important because the revenue had to be taken out of the economy in order to pay the debt, because unfortunately, one of the big mistakes they made in the 70s, they started borrowing from the financial markets, the capitalist financial markets, and that was a devastating mistake. Right? Okay. Also, they allowed, small-scale private enterprises. So, in case you would have come to Hungary in the 1980s, then you could have gone to an enormous number of private restaurants. There is this very Hungarian thing is this baking this Hungarian donut called langos, and then here is a caricature from the period. They were the super rich, right? And then this guy is telling to he says, "Oh, luckily I could always work as a donut maker, right?" And then this is how he looks like, Western car, everything, and so on and so on. And this is the palace. As well. Okay. So the point is that this experiment was going on, But unfortunately, the dark clouds were already coming. How it would be finished. Okay. Now let's talk about the collapse a little bit. Let's talk about the collapse. Well, one of the things, in a very Lukácsian way, was that, of course, ideas have very strong historical function. And then the elites, unfortunately, socialism also had its elites in terms of the intelligentsia and, very importantly, the technocratic professionals. And as it was very much a redistributive system as well, they had a very important role, which meant that whatever happened in this regard, it was, and then this intelligentsia and the technocrats were absolutely amazed by the emerging neoliberal ideology. So very early, key bankers of the country, I mean socialist banks, right, the Hungarian National Bank, so key figures started talking about this market is this superior form. We should have a capital market even. So they started promoting the neoliberal ideology. Of course, they were not alone. We are in the 1980s, everybody was doing that. But it had an impact. And then these people were in a rather important position. This is when Ivan Cellini, the sociologist, talked about, they had a road toward class power. Once in a piece of mine, which I should publish in English, I don't know, it's in my drawer, but hopefully sometimes I do. The intellectuals actually became a transitory class. So during the transition, the intellectuals really got into power, and they really made decisions about ownership. Of course, they were not needed. Capitalists they don't need intellectuals too much, right? So they were pushed aside rather quickly. But during the transition, they were very important. So the key problem we need to understand is really how this story happened, and how this story happened, and then what the role they had. Okay. Also, there was a rather big consensus that the country should move toward the market economy, and they were saying that this second economy, which I explained to you, it was called second economy. I like this. I would like to have a third economy and the fourth economy and the fifth economy as well. In a non-capitalist framework, do not misunderstand me. Right? Then they were saying that no problem, second economy is fantastic because everybody who worked in the second economy would come out as an entrepreneur. And no, sociologists were amazed. I'm not, but many of the sociologists were amazed that, these people who were doing the second economy, they did not become entrepreneurs in the new market economy. For me, completely clear, because they were not entrepreneurs in a socialist framework. They were like a mixed economy actors. They were combining things. Right? That was their knowledge. Combining things and not being a profit-seeking entrepreneur. Of course, then they did. Okay, the next thing which happened, employment was already going down, that's for sure, but all of a sudden, during the transition, the whole thing collapsed, and you can imagine that in such a stable society, the country lost 1.5 million jobs. We are talking about a 10 million country. Right? So in terms of, in a Polanyian term, this embedding the economy was shocking. Right? 1.5 million jobs were lost, out of which 800,000 in the rural economy I was explaining to you. 800,000. It affected women very much. And then there is a horrendous story how they finished the cooperatives. It's one of the, in case you like humor and you are cynical enough, then you can laugh a lot at this. But seeing it from the point of view of people, that's horrendous. Basically, they started giving compensation bonds for the previous owners of the cooperative land. Right? Compensation bonds which were given by the state were absolutely useless. They lost their value almost immediately. They could not be used for anything. There was some kind of a new belief in, private family farming is the best. And this was the ideology, once again, very interestingly, in a very, Blockian way. They started imagining a new history and a new historical time. Of course, nothing came like this. Now, basically, we have large-scale private enterprises. Villages don't produce anything. The land around villages is completely owned by individual large-scale entrepreneurs. Super exploitative how they use the land. With my very good friend who teaches in the US, Salvatore Engel Di Mauro, very good critical geographer, we work together on this land use now, how they and it's horrible. We are basically eating up our future from an ecological point of view. This is what we are doing. So this is extremely tragic, and then this is what you have now. Basically, you have this super machinery, and this is how you. Hungarian land is good land. I mean, don't be mistaken, right? It's a flat country. It's a pancake country, but it has good land, and this is what we are destroying. And then the collapse of all social forms, so socially owned forms. Cooperatives are gone. This kind of a symbiosis between family and large-scale enterprise gone. Even non-market production of vegetable and things are gone. The supermarkets are the prices are so cheap. So in case you go down to villagers and then you say that, why don't you have 2 pork, or why don't you have that and that, and they say, look, I calculated. It's the price of the meat which I produce and what people can get in the supermarket. I can't compete, basically. So prices are not high enough, which is a major problem. And actually, that's actually one of the key points in this economic history is the agrarian prices, right? And then, as I told you in the beginning, Polanyi was correct. We have an authoritarian term in Eastern Europe, which is happening not only in Eastern Europe, be not mistaken, but there are some local factors behind, and then this animosity concerning the consequences of the free market is a key reason why they support the authoritarian term, because they think that these governments are actually trying to defend them. Right? And then one more thing, and then I open up completely. I think this is when Gramsci should come back again. So we should understand this passive revolution going on, right? And then how we are going to have this new authoritarian historical political bloc, right? At the moment, what we can see is the fight for hegemony. But it seems this counter-hegemony of the new right is doing rather well, at least in Eastern Europe. So it's going to be like that. Now this can be understood only in case you go back into history and you understand how the social stability was created and how it was ruined later, and then what kind of consequence it has, right? So Ernst Bloch was also correct, and this is the new way again, that this collapse of a very progressive historical, so I'm reversing Ernst Bloch now. So the collapse of the progressive line can also lead to fascism, right? It's another type of. So this is what I'm thinking about. Yes, and now it's over, right? And here is one more thing from Polanyi, right? This is what I wanted to put out, right?